I remember that Christmas like it was yesterday, though it was years ago now. The kind of Christmas that starts off normal but twists into something I still can't explain, and something I hope never to face again. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters. There was nothing supernatural or made up about it. It was just real, raw, and terrifying in its own way. It all began a few days before Christmas, when the weather had turned cold enough to freeze the breath in the air, and the sky was a dull, heavy gray, full of thick clouds promising snow. I had decided to spend Christmas alone that year. My family was scattered, and for once, I wanted to get away from the usual noise, the crowded rooms, the fake smiles, and the endless small talk. I packed up some things and rented a small cabin a couple of hours outside the city, deep in the woods where the only company was trees and silence. The cabin was old but sturdy, with wood walls and a fireplace that promised warmth. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for what I wanted. Quiet and a break from everything. When I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows between the snow-covered pine trees. The air was sharp and smelled like cold earth and pine needles. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, and the tires of my car crunched loudly over the frozen gravel. The whole place felt untouched, as if the world stopped here, far from any signs of life. I carried my bags inside, lit the fire, and settled in with some simple food. The silence was thick, almost too heavy to breathe at first, but after a while, it became comforting. That first night, the wind howled outside like a restless beast, rattling the window panes. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, but I told myself it was just the wind and that I was safe inside. I wrapped myself in a blanket and watched the fire flicker, its warmth pushing back the cold creeping through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and steady, blanketing everything in white. The next day, I took a walk in the woods. The snow muffled my footsteps, making the forest eerily quiet except for the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches heavy with snow. I wandered further than I meant to, losing track of time as I admired the frozen landscape. The silence was almost peaceful, but there was a strange feeling in the air, like I was being watched, though I saw no one. When the sky started to dim, I turned back, but the path I thought I knew seemed unfamiliar. The snow had covered my tracks, and I realized I had no clear way back. I started to feel the first real sense of panic. My phone had no signal, and the cold was beginning to bite through my jacket. I tried to stay calm, following what I hoped was the right direction, but as the darkness fell faster than I expected, the forest turned into a maze. The trees seemed to close in around me, shadows stretching like fingers in the fading light. I hurried, heart pounding, feeling every snap of a twig and crunch of snow as if it were a warning. Hours later, I found my way back to the cabin, exhausted and shaken. The warmth inside was a relief, but the fear lingered. I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, sat by the fire, and tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The snowstorm outside had picked up, and the wind was louder now, almost drowning out the sound of my own breathing. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. Around midnight, the power went out. The whole forest plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the fire I kept burning. The wind slammed against the walls, and at one point, I heard a long, low noise outside. A groan or maybe a howl, I couldn't tell. My mind raced, but I forced myself to believe it was just the storm. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the snow was deeper, piling against the cabin walls. When I tried to drive out, the car was stuck, buried under a heavy blanket of snow. The roads were impassable, and I was trapped. The isolation hit me hard then. No phone, no way out, no one around for miles. I began rationing food and firewood, knowing I might be stuck for days. The days passed slowly. I explored the nearby woods cautiously, marking my trail with little piles of stones. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional bird call or the creak of ice on the trees. But something else was there too, a presence I couldn't explain. I kept finding signs that someone or something had been close. Footprints in the snow near the cabin that didn't match mine. Broken branches on paths I had cleared. faint shadows at the edge of my vision. I told myself it was probably an animal or another lost traveler, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. One evening, as the light faded, I noticed something strange outside the window. The snow near the door was disturbed, like someone had been digging or scratching at it. I looked closer and saw deep marks in the snow that didn't look like animal tracks. They were too large and too human-like. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to investigate. The cold air was sharp, and my breath came out in quick clouds. The marks led into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I debated following them but didn't want to leave the safety of the cabin after dark. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. That night, I barely slept again. Every creak, every gust of wind seemed amplified in the silence. I kept checking the locks and windows, making sure everything was secure. Over the next day, I searched around the cabin more carefully. The snow around the house was disturbed in places I hadn't seen before. There were strange signs carved into the bark of trees nearby. Simple marks, like tally marks or scratches, but their meaning was unknown and unnerving. The feeling of being watched was constant, like eyes following me no matter where I went. One afternoon, I spotted something on the far edge of the woods, a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved. It wasn't a person I recognized, dressed in dark clothes and standing very still. When it noticed me, it vanished quickly behind the trees. I didn't follow. My heart raced, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. Who else could be out here? What did they want? The days blurred after that. I stayed mostly inside, keeping the fire going and rationing food. I made sure the doors were locked tight and kept a large kitchen knife nearby. The nights were the worst. The wind's howling seemed to carry whispers, and shadows danced outside the windows. Once, I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I stayed as quiet as possible, barely daring to breathe. On Christmas Eve, the power flickered on briefly, then went out again. The storm outside had returned with a vengeance, and the wind pushed hard against the walls. The snow piled up higher, blocking windows and almost burying the porch. I knew the roads were completely blocked now, and I was truly alone. Around midnight, I woke to a noise at the door, a heavy, scraping sound. My heart stopped. I stayed still, listening as the noise repeated, slow and steady. Something was trying to get in. The scraping stopped, then footsteps retreated into the woods. I didn't dare look outside. The next morning, Christmas Day, the storm had calmed but left a thick layer of ice over everything. I opened the door carefully, stepping out into the freezing air. The snow was packed down heavily near the door, with clear footprints leading away into the woods. The prints were large, deeper than mine, and they disappeared suddenly behind a cluster of trees. I followed them cautiously, feeling every crunch of ice beneath my boots. The footprints led to a small clearing where the snow was trampled and disturbed. There, half buried in the snow, was a small, weathered box. I picked it up, and inside were old, rusty tools, an axe head, some wire, and a pair of gloves. I had no idea who had left them or why. That moment, I realized I was not just stuck by the storm. I was being watched, hunted maybe. Someone knew I was there, and they were close enough to leave marks and strange gifts. Fear gripped me fully then, but so did a fierce determination to survive. I packed what I could carry and prepared to leave the cabin behind. The roads were impassable, but I had to try. I trudged through the snow, following what I hoped was the right direction toward a main road. The cold was brutal, my legs heavy with every step. I thought I heard footsteps again, distant but close enough to make my skin crawl. I pushed on, not daring to stop or look back. Hours later, exhausted and nearly frozen, I saw headlights through the trees. A snowplow was clearing the road. I waved frantically until it stopped, and the driver helped me get to safety. The nightmare was over, but the memories of those dark days and nights in the cabin stayed with me. I never found out who or what was out there in the woods that Christmas. All I know is that sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They are real people and the terrifying unknown that lurks in the silence of a cold, lonely night. I had never really liked Christmas much, but that year I found myself alone in a small, old house on the edge of town, with nothing but silence and cold air around me. The streets were mostly empty. The few neighbors I knew had gone away to be with their families, and I wasn't expecting anyone to visit. I had no family nearby, no plans, just the usual hum of the heating system and the occasional creaks of the old wooden floor. The night started like any other cold December evening. The sky was dark and heavy with thick clouds that blocked out any moonlight. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, covering everything in a quiet, white blanket. The silence outside was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, a stillness so deep it almost feels like the world has stopped moving. I had finished setting up a small Christmas tree I found in the corner of the garage, dusty and forgotten, but it was something. I wrapped the string lights around it slowly, the soft yellow glow making the room feel warmer, less empty. I placed some old ornaments I had kept from past years. Nothing special, just a few glass balls and a faded star on top. It felt strange, decorating for Christmas when there was no one to share it with, but I wanted something to hold on to, some normality in the quiet. After that, I went into the kitchen and made some coffee. The kettle's whistle was sharp and sudden in the quiet house. I sat down at the small table by the window, staring out at the snow-covered street. The trees bent under the weight of the snow, their branches heavy and still. Everything looked so calm, but the cold seemed to seep through the glass and into my bones. The house creaked and settled as it always did at night. Old houses do that, I told myself. The wooden beams contract and expand, making noises that can easily make your skin crawl when you're alone. But I tried to ignore it. I had always been a light sleeper, and the silence made every small sound echo too loudly. Around midnight, I decided to check the locks again, even though I had already locked every door and window before I went to bed. The house felt unusually quiet. No wind outside, no distant sounds of cars or footsteps. The only noise was my own breathing and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. As I went to the front door, I noticed the porch light was flickering. It blinked off and on, throwing strange shadows onto the snow. I reached out to press the switch, but it didn't respond. The bulb must have been faulty. I stepped outside, the cold hitting me instantly, sharp and biting. The snow crunched under my boots. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the driveway, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and still, almost blending into the darkness. My heart jumped, a sudden rush of fear rising from deep inside. I blinked and looked again, but the figure was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light or a shadow from the trees. I closed the door firmly behind me and locked it once more, double-checking every lock. Back inside, I pulled the curtains shut and drew the blinds tight. The house suddenly felt smaller, more confined. I tried to focus on the Christmas tree lights, but they seemed dull, like their glow was fading. The flickering porch light outside was gone now, replaced by total darkness. I decided to sit in the living room, the coffee forgotten on the table. The quiet was overwhelming. My eyes kept darting to the windows, expecting to see the figure again. The minutes dragged on like hours. Then came the sound. A slow, heavy scraping noise from outside, near the front door. It was faint, but unmistakable. A long, slow scratch, like something dragging across the wood or the concrete porch. I froze, heart pounding loud in my chest. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe ice shifting on the ground. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate, moving around the edge of the house. I crept toward the window, peeking through the glass. The street was empty, coated in snow, untouched except for one set of footprints leading from the driveway to the porch. The footprints were fresh, deep in the snow. Someone had been here. I stepped back, breath catching in my throat. The footprints stopped right at the front door. No prints leading away. Whoever it was, they had come and stayed. I looked around the room, searching for something to defend myself with. My hands found a heavy metal flashlight on the shelf. It felt cold and solid in my grip. The scratching stopped. Silence fell again. But I knew it wasn't over. Then, a sharp knock on the door. Not a friendly knock, but a hard, urgent pounding that made my heart leap into my throat. It was slow and heavy, like someone trying to force their way in. I didn't move, just stared at the door. The knocking stopped suddenly. I waited, breathing shallow, every muscle tense. Then, a whisper of movement from the back of the house. The sound of footsteps on the wooden deck behind me, soft but certain. I moved slowly toward the back window, careful not to make noise. Peering out, I could just see a dark shape moving away into the night. No face, no features, just a shadow disappearing into the darkness. My phone was in the other room. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to leave the door unlocked or the windows open. The house felt vulnerable, like it could be broken into at any moment. I checked all the doors again, one by one. The back door was locked tight, but the lock looked scratched. The wood around the handle was splintered and worn. Someone had tried to force it. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight and moved to the kitchen window. The snow outside was still fresh, except for those one set of footprints at the front. No sign of anyone else. I sat back down at the table, my mind racing. Why would someone come here, to this empty house on Christmas night? I had no valuables, no reason for anyone to be here. Hours passed like this. The scraping sound never returned. No more knocks, no voices, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the steady tick of the clock. At dawn, I finally allowed myself to step outside. The snow was thick and heavy. I followed the footprints from the driveway to the porch again, then looked closely at the door. The scratches around the handle were deep, as if someone had tried to pry it open with a tool. There were no footprints leading away, but on the ground by the porch, I found something small and strange. An old rusty key lying in the snow. I picked it up, feeling the cold bite into my fingers. It was heavy and worn, as if it had been buried underground for a long time before someone dropped it here. I tried it on the door lock. Fit perfectly. That didn't make sense. Why would someone try to break in, but leave the key behind? I sat down on the porch steps, watching the sun rise over the silent town. The air was cold and sharp, but the feeling of dread stayed with me. I didn't sleep that day. For days after, I stayed alert, checking the locks every night, watching the street from every window. But no one came back. No footsteps, no noises. Yet, every time I passed the door, I felt eyes on me, like someone was still there, waiting. The key stayed in my pocket. The house never felt safe again. It was one of those cold December days where the sky hung low and gray, pressing down on everything like a heavy blanket. The air smelled sharp with frost and the faint scent of pine from the trees outside. I was home alone for Christmas Eve, something I didn't expect this year. Usually, the house was packed with family, laughter, and noise, but this time, I was by myself. My parents had gone to visit relatives out of town, and my siblings were busy with their own plans. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak from the wooden floors settling in the cold. I had spent the afternoon doing small things, setting up the Christmas tree by the big living room window, making sure the lights were evenly spread, and arranging the few decorations I had. The tree wasn't huge, but it was perfect for the space, tall enough to reach the ceiling but narrow enough to fit in the corner. I plugged in the tiny white lights, and the soft glow gave the room a warm feeling against the cold outside. Outside, the world was coated with a thin layer of snow, not the kind that blankets everything thickly and muffles sound, but enough to leave the roads slick and the branches of the trees heavy with ice crystals. It was the kind of snow that made you cautious when you stepped outside, knowing that the frozen ground could be slippery in unexpected places. As the day faded, the dim light from the gray sky turned into the deep blue of early evening. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pools of yellow on the snow-covered sidewalks. I kept checking the window, watching the empty street, waiting for someone, anyone, to show up. But no cars passed, no neighbors walked by, and the usual Christmas crowds seemed to have vanished. I had planned to spend the evening making a simple dinner and then watching some old Christmas movies. But as the darkness deepened, I felt an uneasy sense of stillness in the air, like something was off, even though nothing looked wrong. Around 7, I heard the first noise. It was faint, almost too soft to notice at first. A scraping sound, like metal against stone or the slow dragging of something heavy. It seemed to come from the back of the house near the garage. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I froze, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch rubbing against the side of the house. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate scraping, followed by a faint thud. It was too steady to be the wind, and it didn't sound like an animal. I stood up and walked cautiously to the kitchen window, the one that looked out toward the driveway and garage. The snow was still falling lightly now in slow, heavy flakes. The yard was empty. No footprints except mine leading back from the front door. But the garage door was slightly cracked open. Not much, just enough to see a dark gap underneath. I didn't remember leaving it open. The scraping sound stopped when I looked, but a cold feeling settled deep in my chest. I went to the hall closet and grabbed the flashlight we kept there for power outages. The batteries were fresh because I had checked them just a few days ago. Holding the flashlight tightly, I moved slowly toward the back door that led to the garage. Each step felt heavier than the last, the floor creaking beneath me in a way that seemed louder than usual. I stopped just inside the door, shining the beam toward the garage. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow circle, landing on the snow-covered driveway outside the garage door. There were strange marks on the snow, deep scratches or grooves, running from the edge of the garage to the street. They looked like something had been dragged. The snow around the marks was disturbed, not smooth and untouched like the rest of the yard. A sudden thought hit me. Someone could be out there, not just messing around, but someone who had come up close enough to leave those marks. My mind raced. Why would someone be at my house, in the middle of Christmas Eve, dragging something heavy across the snow? I told myself to stay calm and think. I locked the door behind me and pulled the garage door closed as far as it would go. But it didn't shut all the way, there was some kind of obstruction. I switched on the flashlight again and pushed gently at the door. The scraping noise started again from the other side, slow and steady. Whatever was out there was moving something. The garage wasn't connected to the house in the usual way. It was a separate building at the end of the driveway, about 15 yards from the house. The cold wind slipped through the small cracks in the garage walls, making the sound of scraping louder and sharper. I felt the weight of the situation settle fully on me. I was alone, in a quiet neighborhood, with someone or something just outside in the dark. No one else was around to help. The logical part of me told me to call the police. But the phone in the house was old and sometimes dropped the line, especially in bad weather. My cell phone was upstairs, charging. I didn't want to move away from the garage door to get it. Instead, I took a deep breath and moved toward the side window of the garage. It was small, fogged with ice on the edges, but I could see through the center. I aimed the flashlight at the glass and peered inside. Inside the garage was mostly dark, but the beam caught the edge of a large, wrapped object lying on the floor near the back wall. It was covered in a heavy tarp, the kind used for covering tools or old furniture. The scraping had stopped. I stood still, listening. The only sounds were the wind and the faint creak of the old garage. I waited. After a few moments, the silence grew heavy, almost unbearable. Suddenly, the tarp shifted. It moved just enough for me to see the edge of something underneath it. A pair of worn-out boots. I froze. The boots weren't mine, and they weren't familiar. They were dirty and scuffed, with the kind of wear you'd expect from someone who spent a lot of time outside, maybe working or hiking. The thought that someone was hiding in my garage made the cold spread through me like ice water. My hands shook as I raised the phone from the kitchen counter and dialed 911. The line was silent at first, then a faint voice answered. I whispered the address and explained the situation as clearly as I could without making noise. While waiting for the police, I moved back inside the house, locking the door behind me and blocking it with a heavy chair. The lights inside felt too bright now, almost fake, compared to the darkness outside. After what felt like forever, I heard the sound of sirens approaching, distant at first and then closer. I peeked through the window and saw 2 police cars pull up to the driveway, their lights cutting through the night like sharp blades. Officers jumped out with flashlights and started moving toward the garage. Minutes later, one of them came back, signaling me to open the door. Inside the garage, they found an old man lying under the tarp. He was unconscious but breathing. The police said he had likely broken into the garage to escape the cold and had been hiding there for hours. Apparently, he had been reported missing from a nearby shelter a few days before. The cold could have killed him if he had stayed outside much longer. After they took him to the hospital, I stood in the doorway of the garage, watching the snow fall quietly around me. The fear I had felt earlier faded, replaced by a strange mixture of relief and sadness. That night, the meaning of Christmas hit me differently. It wasn't about decorations or presents or even the lights on the tree. It was about survival, about the people who don't have a warm home or family to be with, and about the thin line between safety and danger that so many walk every day. I sat back inside, the lights dimmed, the quiet returning. I never forgot the sound of that scraping, the feel of cold pressing against the glass, or the sight of those worn boots beneath the tarp. That Christmas left a mark on me. Not the kind you see, but the kind that stays in your mind long after the season is over. It was the coldest Christmas I'd experienced in years. The kind of cold that gets under your skin and never really leaves, no matter how many layers you wear. I decided to spend the holiday alone, out in the countryside, away from the usual noise and crowds. The small cabin I rented sat on the edge of a thick forest in northern Vermont. It was a wooden structure, old but sturdy, with a stone chimney and frosted windows that caught the faint glow of moonlight on Christmas Eve. The drive up had been long and tiring. Snow had been falling steadily all day, thick flakes covering the winding roads and making the trip slower than I expected. The car's heater had been working overtime, but even that couldn't stop my fingers from going numb once I had to get out and unlock the cabin door. As I stepped inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and a faint mustiness, the kind that only comes from a place left empty for months. I hadn't seen anyone else here for a while. The owner mentioned the place was usually busy during summer, but winter brought silence. I dropped my bags by the door and turned on the small heater in the corner, which rattled loudly before sputtering to life. The cabin was small, just a living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom with a sagging bed, and a bathroom with a leaky faucet. I unpacked some food I'd brought, mostly canned goods and frozen meat, and decided I'd try to make something warm to eat soon. The storm outside was worsening. The wind howled against the walls, shaking the windows and making the wooden beams creak. Later, as I settled into a threadbare armchair, I stared out the window at the dense forest surrounding the cabin. The trees stood tall and still, covered in thick blankets of snow. Everything was eerily quiet except for the storm's occasional roar. I couldn't see any signs of life, no houses, no lights, nothing but endless white and dark shapes. The isolation was part of the plan, but even then, I felt a creeping unease I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I decided to build a fire in the fireplace. I stacked dry logs, struck a match, and watched the flames grow slowly, casting flickering shadows on the rough walls. The warmth spread quickly, pushing back the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I sat back and pulled a thick blanket over my lap, the soft fabric offering some comfort against the loneliness. Then I heard it, a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch scraping the window. But it didn't stop. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate, like footsteps crunching on snow, but heavy and careful. I stood up and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I couldn't see anything, but the sound kept coming closer, then stopped. My heart started to race. I wasn't expecting anyone. The road was supposed to be impassable because of the snow. No one else should be out here. I backed away from the window and checked the locks on the doors, making sure everything was secure. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd brought with me, a precaution more than anything, and sat back down, eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. Time passed slowly. The noises didn't come again. Maybe it had been an animal. Deer sometimes come close to cabins, looking for shelter or food. I told myself that, but the feeling in my gut was telling me otherwise. The house felt different, heavier somehow. The fire was dying down, and the cold started creeping in again. I decided to try to sleep to get through the night. I climbed into the bed, wrapped myself in the thick blanket, and closed my eyes. The wind outside kept up its howl, and somewhere in the distance, a tree creaked and groaned. After a while, I thought I heard the noise again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the snow right outside. Then a silence so complete it was almost louder than the sound itself. I got up quietly and moved to the door, heart pounding, bat in hand. I pressed my ear to the wood and waited. Nothing. I opened the door a crack and looked outside. The snow was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign anyone had been near. I stood there for a few moments, breathing the cold air, trying to calm down. Back inside, I noticed the batteries for my flashlight were almost dead. I'd forgotten to bring spares. The old lantern worked, but the light was weak and flickered. I knew I should probably stay inside and wait for morning, but the isolation was eating at me. I needed some kind of distraction. I decided to check the kitchen for more firewood. I grabbed my coat and boots and stepped outside. The snow was thick, and it was hard to walk, but I had to get more wood or the fire would go out completely. The forest around the cabin was black and silent, the snow muffling all sounds. I walked carefully to the woodpile behind the house. As I bent down to pick up a log, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, quick and low, disappearing behind a tree. My heart jumped again. I told myself it was probably just a rabbit or some other small animal. But when I looked around, the trees were still and the snow smooth. No tracks, no movement. I grabbed several logs and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The fire roared back to life, and the warmth filled the cabin. I sat down, breathing hard, trying to calm myself. What was going on out there? The night dragged on. I stayed by the fire, watching the shadows dance on the walls. At some point, I fell into a light sleep, only to be jolted awake by a loud bang on the door. I froze. The sound echoed through the small cabin, sharp and real. My hands shook as I grabbed the bat. The banging came again, more forceful this time. I waited, heart pounding, then slowly crept to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but swirling snow. I opened the door just a crack and shouted, hoping to scare off whoever or whatever was outside. No answer. No sound except the storm. I stepped outside quickly, looking around with the weak lantern light. The snow was falling hard, and the ground was smooth and untouched. The banging must have come from something hitting the door in the wind. Relief mixed with frustration. I closed the door and locked it tight. But then, I noticed something. A set of footprints, leading away from the cabin into the woods. They were large, heavy prints, not animal, not human either. The shape was odd, uneven. I stared at them, frozen. How had they gotten there if the road was closed? If no one had been around? I followed the tracks a little way, my breath freezing in the cold air, heart pounding louder than the storm. The prints vanished suddenly near the edge of the forest, swallowed by the deep snow. Something was wrong, very wrong. I hurried back to the cabin, bolted the door, and barricaded it with a heavy chair. I didn't sleep again that night. At dawn, the storm stopped. The sky cleared, revealing pale sunlight and heavy, white snow everywhere. I decided to leave immediately, pack up, and get out before anything else could happen. But as I opened the door, I saw the footprints had circled around the cabin, as if someone or something had been watching me all night. I jumped in the car and started the engine, the heater blasting warm air. As I drove away, I looked back once. In the distance, near the tree line, I thought I saw a figure standing still, watching me leave. The road was clear now, but I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I never went back to that cabin again. cold was biting, sharper than I had expected for December. The kind of cold that cuts through your coat and sinks into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I was alone in my old family house, the one I'd grown up in but had only come back to for Christmas because of some stubborn loyalty to tradition. The house sat on the edge of town, where the streetlights ended and the woods began, their bare branches scratching the dark sky like long fingers. It was quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional creak or groan from the old wood settling, and the wind that whispered through the broken shutters. I had arrived late that afternoon after a long drive through the empty roads coated with ice and snow. The kind of snow that muffles sound, making the world feel like it's been wrapped in cotton. I carried in the few bags of groceries I'd brought, along with a couple of boxes of firewood, and set about lighting the old fireplace. It was stubborn, and I had to coax it with kindling and patience before the flames finally took, crackling and spitting warmth into the room. The house was full of memories, but also the weight of neglect. Dust lay thick on the shelves, and the faint smell of damp lingered in the corners. Outside, the street was deserted. Every house on my street was empty for the holidays, or at least that's what I thought. The only light came from the yellow glow of my porch lamp and the distant flicker of one or two other homes far away in the neighborhood. The woods were a black wall pressing in close, and I found myself staring out the window more than I wanted to, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. That first night, I settled into the living room with a blanket and an old book, the fire flickering beside me. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise seemed louder, sharper, more deliberate. The house groaned like it was alive, shifting in the cold. At one point, I heard something outside, a sharp crack like a branch breaking. I paused and listened. Nothing, just the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The next day, I made a list of things to fix around the house, starting with the broken windows in the kitchen and the peeling paint on the front door. But even with busy work, the unease stayed with me. In the afternoon, I went outside to clear the walkway of snow, each breath steaming in the cold air. The trees around the property seemed too still, too watchful. I noticed footprints in the snow near the edge of the woods, single prints, large and not human. They led from the woods toward my house, stopping just short of the porch steps. My heart thudded as I followed the tracks back the way they came, but they disappeared into the trees. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or some wild animal. It was nothing. Still, I locked every door and window twice before going back inside. That night was worse. The noises outside grew more frequent. Scraping sounds along the side of the house, footsteps crunching over the snow. I kept checking the locks even though I knew they were secure. I didn't dare look outside. The darkness felt heavy, pressing against the windows like it wanted in. I stayed by the fire, the only warmth I had, watching the shadows flicker on the walls. On Christmas Eve, the temperature dropped even further. Ice glazed the branches, making the whole yard glitter in the weak moonlight. I spent the day cleaning the house, trying to keep my mind busy. But as night fell, I noticed the footprints again, closer this time, circling around the house. More than one set now, as if something or someone was moving around in the darkness. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass or damaged locks. Yet the noises persisted. I could hear breathing sometimes, heavy and uneven, outside my bedroom window. Once, I thought I saw a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every hour felt like a lifetime, my eyes glued to the window. As dawn began to break, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard. It was hunched over, large, wearing a heavy coat and something over its head that obscured the face. The figure didn't move for a long time, then turned and disappeared into the woods. By morning, I was exhausted, shaken. I debated leaving, but the roads were icy, and I was miles from town with no cell reception in the house. I was trapped in this old, creaking building surrounded by silence and shadows. On Christmas Day, the quiet was broken only by the sound of distant sirens, a rare sign of life in the cold and snow. I made a plan to get through the day. I lit the fire early and made coffee, trying to keep my spirits up with memories of better holidays past. The tree, decorated with old ornaments, stood in the corner, casting soft colors across the room. But as evening came, the noises started again, louder and more insistent. Scratches along the walls, footsteps on the porch, something pounding faintly against the front door. I didn't dare open it. I pulled the curtains closed tight and sat in the darkened living room, the fire now just embers. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the house. I jumped, heart racing, every muscle tense. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door and crept cautiously toward the kitchen. The back door was slightly ajar, swinging in the cold wind, snow blowing inside. I shut it firmly and locked it again, the cold seeping into the room. I checked every window, all still locked. The footprints outside were fresh, circling the house like some cruel game. Whoever or whatever was out there was not afraid of me. They were toying with me. The night dragged on, and eventually, dawn began to show faint light through the blinds. Exhausted, I sat on the floor by the fireplace, trying to calm my shaking hands. The sounds stopped, and the house fell silent again. In the daylight, I inspected the damage. There were scratches on the back door frame, deep and jagged, as if someone had tried to force their way in. I noticed the footprints once more, larger and more numerous than before, leading away from the house toward the woods. I realized then that it wasn't some animal. The prints were too big, too deliberate. Someone had been watching me for days, creeping around the house, waiting for me to be alone. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through me, but I also felt a growing determination. I wasn't going to be a victim in my own home. I packed a bag with essentials, some food, water, and a flashlight, and left the house, locking the doors behind me. The snow crunched underfoot as I walked toward the road, every step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't look back. Eventually, I reached a neighbor's house where I was able to call the police. They came out, searched the area, but found no one. The footprints led deep into the woods and vanished. I never went back to that house after that Christmas. It was clear someone had been stalking the place, watching and waiting. The thought that someone was so close, so hidden, while I sat inside, pretending everything was normal, was the most terrifying part. The woods that night were filled with quiet menace, a reminder that danger often comes not from stories or myths, but from real people with real intentions. And sometimes the scariest thing is knowing that you were never truly safe, not even in the place you called home. The snow fell quietly outside my window, the kind of slow, soft flakes that drift down like dust, layering the world in white. It was Christmas Eve, and the silence in my small apartment was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. I was alone, as I had been the last few years during the holidays. I didn't mind the solitude much anymore. The city outside looked peaceful, lights twinkling from distant windows and street lamps, the occasional car passing on the icy streets. Everything felt frozen in place, calm, like a still photograph waiting for something to happen. I had spent the day running errands, picking up last-minute groceries, wrapping gifts nobody would open with me, buying a cheap bottle of wine to toast the night. The routine was familiar, boring, and I welcomed it. I set up the small tree I'd bought from the market, its fake needles slightly scratched and plastic, but it filled the corner of my living room with a touch of green. The little colored lights blinked on, casting a soft glow against the plain walls. I lit a few candles on the windowsill, their flickering flames making shadows dance like ghosts. Outside, the snow had piled up, thick and heavy, muffling every sound. The street was deserted, except for a figure moving far down the block. A man, bundled in a heavy coat, his face hidden beneath a hood. I watched him for a moment, wondering why anyone would be out so late on Christmas Eve in this cold. The streetlights flickered and buzzed, and then one went dark, leaving a patch of blackness that swallowed the sidewalk like a hole. I turned back inside, feeling a chill creep through the room, despite the heat. The wind howled softly outside, pressing against the windows. I wrapped myself tighter in a blanket, poured the wine into a glass, and sat near the tree, watching the lights pulse in the dimness. Hours passed slowly. I lost track of time, my mind wandering. The city's quietness felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Then, suddenly, I heard it. A faint sound at first, like a scraping or a knock on the door. My heart jumped. I didn't expect anyone. I stayed still, listening. The noise came again, louder this time. I stood and moved to the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Nothing, just the snowy street, empty and still. I opened the door a crack, peeking out. The snow was falling thicker now, the wind stronger. Footprints led away from the building, deep and fresh, but no one was around. I closed the door, locked it. Back inside, I tried to shake the unease creeping over me. Maybe it was just someone lost or a prank. I checked the windows. They were all locked tight, frosted over from the cold. I went back to the living room, but the feeling didn't go away. Suddenly, the power went out. The room went dark except for the candles. The heater stopped, and the cold rushed in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The snowstorm outside must have knocked out the lines. I was alone, in the dark, the silence now thick and heavy. Then I heard it. Footsteps outside my apartment door, slow and deliberate. Not the light steps of someone passing, but heavy, purposeful. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call for help, but my phone was dead. The candles flickered as the temperature dropped. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I pressed my back against the wall, heart pounding. Then a quiet scraping sound, like something being pushed against the wood. I realized with growing dread that someone was trying to break in. I looked around, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. The wine bottle, a heavy book. My mind raced. The door shuddered under the weight of whoever was outside. I braced myself, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Suddenly, the door slammed open. A figure stepped in, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. It was the man I'd seen earlier, his face obscured by shadows, eyes cold and unblinking. He moved fast, too fast. I stumbled back, falling onto the floor. He grabbed me and I fought, but the cold grip was strong. He dragged me toward the window, the snow swirling outside like a storm of needles. Panic flooded me as I struggled, every muscle burning. I managed to push him away for a moment and scrambled to my feet. I ran toward the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the counter. He followed, silent and relentless. I held the knife in front of me, hands shaking. He stopped, eyeing me, then suddenly turned and fled out the door. I didn't stop to watch. I locked the door, checked the windows again, and called the police as soon as my phone regained signal. They arrived hours later, searching the building and the streets, but no one was found. The footprints led away into the storm, swallowed by the falling snow. They said it was likely a robbery attempt or a random break-in, but the fear stayed with me long after. That Christmas, the snow kept falling, covering everything in silence. The warmth I sought inside was gone, replaced by a cold I couldn't shake. The man outside had vanished, but the memory of his presence lingered, like a shadow in the flickering candlelight. The cold air outside had a sharp bite to it that Christmas Eve. I had just arrived at the old cabin deep in the woods, the one I had rented for the holiday weekend. I wanted a quiet, peaceful Christmas away from the noise of the city, away from all the usual chaos. The road leading to the cabin was rough, covered in patches of ice and snow, the kind of road you had to drive slowly on or risk spinning off. When I finally parked the car, the silence hit me like a wall. No sounds of people, no cars, no distant music. Just the wind and the trees. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, made of thick logs that looked like they had been there for decades. The windows were frosted over, but I could see the faint glow of the fireplace inside. I grabbed my bags and stepped out into the cold. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the snow crunched under my boots. As I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the warmth inside hit me immediately. The air smelled of pine and burning wood, comforting and familiar. I set my bags down and looked around. The cabin was simple, with a living room, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in some spots, and the floor creaked when I walked on it. The fireplace was already lit, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows on the walls. I dropped my coat and boots by the door and moved closer to the fire. Outside, the wind howled softly, shaking the trees and making the branches scrape against the cabin like long fingers tapping on the walls. The sound was eerie, but the fire kept me warm and grounded. I spent the next hour unpacking and setting things up. I had brought a small Christmas tree with me, along with a few decorations and some string lights. I plugged in the lights, and they cast a soft, colorful glow across the room. As night fell, the darkness outside grew heavy and thick. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the snow-covered ground reflected nothing but black. Inside, I tried to keep my mind busy. I cooked a simple dinner on the stove, canned soup and some bread, and ate slowly by the fire. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the crackling of the wood and the occasional creak from the old cabin. Later, I settled into a worn armchair near the fire with a book. But sleep was hard to come by. Every small noise made me jump. The wind banging against the windows, the wood settling, the distant sound of something moving through the snow outside. My mind started to wander, and I felt a slow, creeping unease settle in. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, crunching in the snow, close by. I stood up and peered through the frosted window, but there was nothing but dark trees and falling snow. The steps stopped as suddenly as they had started. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal or the wind playing tricks. I went to bed, but the unease followed me. The bed creaked, and the old floorboards moaned with the cold. My heart beat faster each time the wind shook the cabin. It was like the darkness outside was pressing against the walls, trying to get in. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise that wasn't the wind or the house settling. It was a low thud, coming from the kitchen, slow and deliberate like something heavy being dropped. I froze, listening hard. The sound came again, this time closer, and then silence. I didn't have any company out here, and the cabin was supposed to be isolated. My mind raced with thoughts, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and crept out of the room. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the kitchen floor. Everything looked normal, except for the wooden chair which had been knocked over. The chair legs scratched against the floor in the pale light. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints by the door, nothing. My breath came out fast, and my hands shook slightly. I checked all the doors and windows. They were locked tight. The old cabin's locks had rusty bolts and heavy latches, all secure. Still, the noise had been real. I couldn't explain it. Back in bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind had died down now, but the quiet was worse. It was the kind of quiet that made every sound feel loud. Suddenly, I heard a faint scraping noise, like nails or claws against wood. Came from the side of the cabin, near the back. My heart jumped again. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but it sounded too deliberate, too slow. I stayed still for what felt like an hour until the noise stopped. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't get much sleep. In the morning, I found fresh footprints in the snow outside the cabin's back door. They were large and deep, and they circled around the cabin before fading into the trees. They weren't human footprints, too wide and uneven. I stared at them, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I thought about leaving right then, but my car was stuck in the snow, and the roads were still icy and dangerous. I was trapped. That day, I tried to keep busy. I chopped some firewood, cleaned the cabin, and read more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The windows seemed to reflect movement in the trees, shadows that vanished when I looked directly. At night, the noises returned. Heavy thuds on the roof, scratches at the windows, the sound of breathing just outside the door. I stayed awake, clutching a kitchen knife, staring into the dark. On the second night, I heard the loudest noise yet, something crashing through the back door. I jumped up, flashlight in hand, and ran to the kitchen. The door was still closed, but the lock had been tampered with. Deep scratches marked the wood near the latch. I froze. Whoever or whatever had done this was close. I locked all the doors and windows again and stayed in the living room, close to the fire. I had no cell signal, no way to call for help. The isolation I had wanted was now a nightmare. The sounds continued for hours. Branches scraping, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. A low growl that made the hair on my arms stand up. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but alive. I opened the door cautiously and looked out. The snow was disturbed all around the cabin. Deep, wide tracks circled and ended at the edge of the forest. I gathered my things quickly, determined to leave no matter what. I managed to start the car after some struggle and drove slowly down the icy road. That night, as I drove away, the cabin disappeared behind me into the thick trees. I never went back. I had been looking forward to Christmas that year, mostly because it had been a tough year overall. The city where I lived was cold and gray in December, but I liked the quiet that came with the snow. I didn't have family close by, and for most of my adult life, Christmas had been a low-key event, more about finding some peace than the usual hustle and noise. That year, I decided to spend Christmas in a small town up north, somewhere less crowded and more still. I rented a cabin about 2 hours away from the city, nestled on the edge of a thick forest. The cabin was simple, not fancy, but warm and comfortable, with a wood stove and a small kitchen. I arrived late afternoon on Christmas Eve. The snow was already deep on the ground, and the bare trees stood tall like silent watchers. The sky was a dull, heavy gray, and a soft wind whispered through the branches. I unloaded my bags, stacked firewood, and lit the stove. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry pine and old wood. The windows were frosted at the edges, and the dim light outside was fading fast. I had brought some food, nothing fancy, just canned soup, bread, cheese, some apples, and a small bottle of whiskey. The idea was to keep things simple, no fuss, just me and the quiet night. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, savoring the silence. There were no other houses visible nearby, just the vast spread of white snow and the dark forest beyond. I set a fire in the stove, and the room quickly warmed up. The crackling wood sounded soft and comforting in the stillness. Outside, the wind picked up a little, rattling the thin window panes. I pulled a blanket over my knees and settled into an old armchair. The only light was from the fire and a small lamp on the table. The world outside was almost entirely silent, except for the occasional creak of trees or the distant sound of snow falling. The night stretched on slowly. I ate some soup, drank a little whiskey, and stared into the fire. The peace was almost perfect, but as the hours passed, something in the quiet started to feel off. It was a feeling I couldn't explain at first. A subtle tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The wind outside had died down, but there was an unease in the stillness, as if something was waiting. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in a remote place like this could play tricks on the mind. But then I started noticing small things, noises I couldn't identify, faint sounds carried on the wind, a rustle, a snap of a twig, the soft crunch of footsteps on snow. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. No movement in the dark woods. I checked the locks on the doors and windows just to be sure. Everything was secure. Still, the feeling lingered. It was a low hum of worry in the back of my mind, the kind that makes your skin crawl just a little. Around midnight, I decided to get some sleep. The bed was simple but warm, and I pulled the blanket up tight. Outside, the forest was black and silent. The only sound was my breathing and the faint whistle of the wind. I tried to focus on that to calm myself, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things. At first, faint noises like someone moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. Then louder, footsteps crunching snow, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I lay still, heart pounding, eyes wide open in the dark. The door was just on the other side of the room. The lock was heavy and solid, but the sound was clear, the slow, deliberate steps coming closer, stopping, then moving away again. It was impossible to tell how many people or if it was just one. I stayed frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes stretched like hours. I wanted to call the police, but there was no cell service out here. The cabin was too far from the road, too isolated. The only way out was a single dirt track that disappeared into the woods. The footsteps continued for what felt like forever. Then suddenly they stopped. The silence returned, thick and heavy. My pulse slowed a little. I told myself it was someone walking by, maybe a hunter or a local checking the area. But the steps hadn't just passed by. They had moved slowly, circling the cabin like they were watching. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed and crept to the window. Peering out into the blackness, I strained to see. The snow was untouched except for one set of footprints leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the trees. No sign of anyone now. I closed the curtains and locked the window again. My hands were shaking. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the room was cold. I wrapped myself in blankets and waited for dawn. Morning finally came, gray and quiet. I stepped outside to look around. The footprints circled the cabin closely but stopped at the edge of the trees. Nothing else was disturbed. No signs of forced entry, no trash or anything left behind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there for a reason. Not just to pass by. Someone had been watching me, waiting. I packed up my things as fast as I could, not bothering to eat or drink. The cold air bit at my face as I loaded the car. When I started driving back down the snowy road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me in the trees. I didn't stop until I was back in the city. Safe. The cold had settled deep into my bones long before the sun slipped behind the thick line of pine trees that ringed the small town where I lived. It was Christmas Eve, a night I'd always associated with warmth, lights, and the quiet joy of family. But this year, the chill in the air seemed different, heavier somehow, as if the cold was not just in the weather, but creeping into something deeper. I'd been alone all day, working to get the last few things done around the house, knowing that the next morning would be the only time I'd see my family in months. They lived several states away, and my job made it impossible to travel at any other time. I had the house mostly ready. The tree stood tall in the corner of the living room, decorated with old ornaments passed down through generations. The lights flickered softly, their warm glow casting long shadows across the walls, mixing with the darkening twilight outside. I could see my breath in the air, even inside, and I wrapped myself tighter in the heavy wool sweater I'd pulled out of the closet earlier that day. The snow had been falling steadily since morning, the flakes thick and soft, piling up against the windowsills and covering the ground in a perfect white blanket. It was the kind of snow that muffled sound, wrapping the world in a quiet so complete it almost felt unnatural. The wind had started to pick up now, and I could hear it whistling outside, shaking the branches of the trees like an unseen force trying to claw its way in. I spent most of the afternoon pacing around the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows more times than I could count. The feeling that something was off wouldn't leave me. It wasn't fear in the usual sense, no direct threat or danger, but a creeping unease, like the air itself had shifted. Every creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet made me jump. Every distant sound carried too clearly in the stillness. The faint rustling of wind-blown branches, the occasional thump against the walls as the house settled. Nothing new or strange in itself, but together they created a tension I couldn't shake. As night fully claimed the sky, the power flickered briefly, and the soft hum of the heater cut out for a moment. My fingers instinctively tightened around the coffee mug I'd been nursing, the sudden dark feeling settling heavy in my chest. I sat down on the couch, staring into the flames of the small fireplace, willing myself to calm down. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth battling the cold that crept in from outside. I thought about the long drive my family was making, the roads likely to be icy and dangerous. I hoped they were safe, The phone lines had been spotty all day, and the cell signal in this part of town was weak at best. I couldn't call or text them to check. That gnawed at me more than I expected. The isolation felt sharper. Outside, the snowstorm grew worse, the gusts of wind scraping against the windows like the scratching of fingernails on wood. I stood up and walked to the front door, pressing my palm against the cold glass. The yard was empty and silent, nothing moving except the swirling flakes. I could barely make out the shapes of the bare trees, their twisted branches stark against the night sky. A sudden noise, a sharp knock on the door, made my heart leap into my throat. I froze. There was no reason for anyone to be out here tonight. Not in this weather. No one was expecting company, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The knock came again, louder this time, deliberate. My skin prickled with alarm. I swallowed hard and stepped back, watching the door as if waiting for it to open on its own. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on the house like a weight. I checked the locks again, ensuring everything was secure, and pulled the curtains closed tight. Settling back on the couch, I tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But the knock had been real, and it had come from outside. Hours passed in restless silence. The fire burned low. The storm raged on, a constant howl around the edges of the house. I kept checking the windows, scanning the dark beyond for any sign of movement. My breath was shallow, heart racing with every little sound. At some point, the power finally went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, save for the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The house grew cold quickly, the heat fading like a fading memory. I lit a few candles, their flickering flames throwing shadows that danced and stretched across the walls. The small room felt suddenly much bigger and much more vulnerable. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I could hear the wind tearing at the roof, the trees groaning under the weight of snow and ice. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, falling heavy against the ground with a thud that echoed in the stillness. Then, a faint sound, a scraping, like something dragging across the driveway outside. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. I could see the outline of something moving beyond the window, just at the edge of the candlelight's reach. I moved quietly to the window, careful not to make a sound. Peering through the glass, I strained to see through the swirling snow. There, just beyond the porch light's faint halo, was a figure, tall, hunched, moving slowly. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm? The thought of a stranger walking up to my house, in the dark, unsettled me deeply. I considered calling the police, but the storm had knocked out the signal hours ago. My landline was dead. No way to reach help. Panic threatened to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. The figure stopped just at the edge of the porch, motionless. I could not see any features, only the outline of someone bundled against the cold. The scraping sound stopped. Minutes passed. The figure moved again, this time stepping closer. The snowflakes clung to the coat, melting slowly in the weak light. Suddenly, the porch light flickered and went out. The figure vanished into the darkness. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might burst. I stepped back from the window, locking the door again and closing every curtain. I sank to the floor, the candles glow warm against the cold wood beneath me. The storm's fury outside was matched only by the storm inside my chest. A mix of fear, confusion, and a desperate hope that whoever that was would just leave. Time passed slowly, the night stretching on with no other sign of life outside. The power stayed off. The fire had died out, leaving the house cold and silent. Then, in the early hours of the morning, as the storm began to ease and the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the snow-covered driveway. A vehicle. I rushed to the window, peering through the frost. A police car was pulling up, headlights cutting through the morning mist. Relief flooded me. I rushed to open the door as soon as they knocked, grateful for the sight of another person. The officers listened as I explained everything. The knocking, the figure, the scraping sounds. They checked around the house and the yard, finding footprints in the snow leading away from the porch, but no other sign of the person. They told me to stay inside and lock the doors, and promised to patrol the area until daylight. In the hours that followed, as the sun finally rose and melted the snow from the trees, the world seemed to breathe a little easier. The storm had passed, and with it, the darkness that had filled the night. I sat by the window, the police car gone now, feeling a quiet gratitude for safety, but also a lingering unease, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening things aren't monsters or spirits, but the unknown people and dangers that walk among us. That Christmas, I didn't feel the usual warmth of the season. Instead, I carried with me the cold and the memory of the night when the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was falling thick outside the window, the kind of snow that muffled the world and made the roads slippery and dangerous. I was alone in the house this year, a small, old place I'd inherited from my grandfather. It sat on the edge of a little town that felt sleepy even on the busiest days, and now, with the heavy snow, it seemed completely cut off from the rest of the world. The house itself was one of those old wooden structures, creaky and cold, the kind of place that held memories in every corner. Old photos in dusty frames, faded wallpaper peeling slightly at the edges, and the smell of wood smoke that never quite left the rooms. I had spent the day cleaning and putting up a small Christmas tree by the window. The tree was sparse, almost bare, but I'd strung it with some cheap colored lights that blinked quietly. A few worn ornaments, some bought cheap years ago, dangled from its thin branches. It felt strange to be setting this all up by myself, but it was my way to hold on to some normalcy. Outside, the wind howled like a restless animal. The storm had been growing all day, and by nightfall the snow was piling high against the windows and the door. I kept a fire going in the old stone fireplace, the crackle and warmth offering a small comfort. Still, the house felt colder than usual, like it was holding its breath. I kept checking the windows, watching the storm rage. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The house went dark except for the faint glow from the fire and the blinking lights on the tree. The storm was so strong that even the radio signal died, leaving the house in a silence that was heavy and complete. I settled down with a blanket near the fireplace, trying to push down a rising feeling of unease. The house made noises, the creaks of wood settling, the groans of the old frame against the wind. But this time, it wasn't the usual sounds. Something felt different. It was as if the house itself was warning me. Outside, the snow had piled so high it covered the lower half of the windows. The streetlights that usually lit up the yard were completely buried under the snowdrifts. I realized I was trapped inside. There was no way out until the storm stopped. Around midnight, the storm quieted slightly. I thought I heard a noise outside the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then the sound came again, a sharp tapping, like someone knocking. The sound was faint but clear. I froze. I told myself it was probably a branch or something falling, maybe an animal. Still, the knocking came again, more insistent this time. It was impossible, though. No one would be out in this storm. The roads were blocked, and the temperature was dropping fast. I wrapped myself tighter in the blanket and tried to ignore it. The knocking stopped. After a few minutes, I thought it might have been my imagination. But then I heard it again, this time louder, closer. It was coming from the back door. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see what was there, but curiosity and fear pushed me forward. I moved carefully across the room, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. I reached the back door, a heavy wooden slab with a frosted glass window that was almost completely covered in snow. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and wiped some snow away. Outside, the yard was empty. No sign of anyone or anything. The snow kept falling thick and fast. I backed away from the door, but the knocking started again, louder, more urgent. My heart pounded as I looked around for something to defend myself with. I grabbed a heavy metal poker from the hearth, feeling its cold weight in my hand. The knocking continued for several more minutes, then suddenly stopped. The The silence that followed was almost worse. I strained to hear anything outside, but there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and snow. I stayed near the door for a long time after that, eyes fixed on the window. Nothing moved. After a while, the sound of the storm and the silence outside lulled me into a tense sleep. When I woke, the sun was just rising, a pale light filtering through the thick snow. The storm had passed, but the world outside was buried deep in white. I looked out the window again, but this time, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the yard toward the back door. Heavy boots, the kind worn by workers or hikers, marked clearly in the fresh snow. But there was something odd. There was only one set of prints. No sign of anyone coming back. I felt a chill run down my spine, colder than the cold air outside. I opened the back door cautiously. The snow was packed down in front of the threshold, the prints fresh and clear. They led straight into the forest that bordered the property. I thought about following the tracks, but quickly decided it wasn't a good idea. The woods were thick and dangerous, especially after the storm. I went back inside and locked the door again. My mind raced with questions. Who was out there last night? Why had they knocked? And why had they left footprints going only one way? That day, I stayed inside, too afraid to go out and look for answers. The phone lines were still down, the power flickering on and off. It was like being cut off from the world, trapped in this isolated house surrounded by the frozen wilderness. That night, I heard the knocking again. This time, it came not just at the back door, but at the front as well. And from the windows, the sound was everywhere. I stayed in the middle of the house, holding the poker tight, waiting. Morning came again, and the footprints were back. More sets this time, circling the house, stopping at every window, every door, but always only leading away into the trees. I checked carefully and found some broken branches, signs that someone or something had passed close by. The police in town told me the roads were still blocked and couldn't come out to check. They told me to stay inside, stay safe, and wait for the storm to clear. They said it was probably just some hunters or lost travelers trying to find shelter. But I knew better. Whoever it was, they had been watching me for days, waiting for something. On Christmas night, the last night before the roads were clear, I heard a noise downstairs, a slow creak, like someone stepping on the old wooden floor. I held my breath, frozen in place. The fire had almost gone out, and the house was dark except for the faint light from the blinking tree. The steps came closer, slow and steady. Then a shadow moved outside the window. I couldn't see a face, just a dark shape moving through the snow. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the battery was dead. The landline was silent. The storm had cut me off completely. I moved quietly to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to peek out. The figure was still there, watching. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped. Hours passed, the figure never left. By morning, when the storm had cleared and the roads were open again, the figure was gone. The footprints around the house were gone too, wiped away by the fresh snowfall. I left the house that day, locking the door behind me and never coming back. The town was quiet, and no one believed what I told them about the footsteps and the watching figure. I never found out who or what it was. But every Christmas since, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees, I remember that night, the fear, the silence, and the feeling that someone was waiting just outside the door, watching. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year, not because of the fancy decorations or the presents, but because it gave me a rare break from the usual noise of life. In the small town I lived in, Christmas was simple and quiet, with most people keeping to their families, lights flickering in windows, and the cold biting the air just enough to remind you it was winter. This year, though, something about the holiday felt different from the start, though I couldn't put my finger on what. It was late December, and the snow had been falling for days, thick and heavy, covering the streets and rooftops in a soft white blanket. The trees in the park were coated with ice, branches bending under the weight, and the whole town looked like a scene from a postcard. I lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by woods that stretched as far as you could see. I liked the quiet, especially around Christmas. I didn't have many family or close friends nearby, so I often spent the holidays by myself, reading books, watching old movies, or just sitting by the fire with a cup of hot chocolate. This year, I decided to do something different. I had been feeling restless, almost like I needed to get away from everything. So I planned a solo camping trip in the woods for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. I wanted to clear my head, spend time alone with nature, and enjoy the silence away from all the holiday noise. I packed my gear carefully: warm clothes, food, a good sleeping bag, a flashlight, and some matches. I told no one where I was going. The plan was simple: hike into the woods, find a spot near a frozen lake I knew about, set up camp, and stay until late on Christmas Day before heading back. The morning of Christmas Eve was clear but bitter cold. I drove my old truck to the trailhead just before dawn. The parking lot was empty except for a few tire tracks in the snow, probably from other hikers or hunters. The trees stood tall, their branches heavy with snow, and the air smelled sharp and clean. As I started walking, the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground was the only sound. The world was silent except for the occasional call of a crow or the faint rustle of wind through the pines. The trail was mostly clear, but snow covered the ground in thick patches. I moved steadily, careful not to slip on ice or get caught in hidden roots. The cold stung my face, and my breath came out in clouds, but I felt good. It was peaceful. The farther I walked, the fewer signs of life I saw. No other hikers, no animals, just the quiet, empty woods. After a few hours, I reached the frozen lake. It was larger than I remembered, and the ice stretched across it like a glass sheet. The surface was smooth, reflecting the pale sky above. I found a clearing near the shore, sheltered by tall fir trees. It was perfect for setting up camp. I pulled my gear from my backpack and started pitching my tent. The fabric was stiff with cold, and my fingers quickly grew numb as I worked. By midday, my camp was ready. I built a small fire pit, gathering dry wood from beneath the trees. Starting a fire in such cold was difficult, but after some effort, the flames caught, casting a warm glow and sending thin tendrils of smoke into the still air. I took a moment to sit near the fire, letting the heat seep into my frozen bones. Around me, the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels scurried. Just the crackling fire and the occasional pop of burning wood. As the afternoon passed, the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. I gathered some food from my pack, canned soup, bread, some cheese, and ate slowly, watching the ice on the lake shimmer faintly in the fading light. The cold was creeping back in, and I wrapped myself tighter in my coat. Night came quickly. Darkness fell like a curtain, thick and complete. The stars came out, cold and bright against the black sky. The fire was my only source of light. I sat close, listening to the quiet, feeling the solitude settle over me like a heavy blanket. It was beautiful in a way I'd never known before. But then I noticed something odd. A sound, faint at first, almost a whisper against the silence. I stopped moving, listening hard. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps on packed snow, but not close, more like coming from the deeper woods behind me. My heart quickened, but I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a wolf moving carefully through the trees. I wasn't afraid, just alert. The noise continued, slow and steady, moving closer in slow steps. I scanned the dark woods with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the night, but I saw nothing. The sound stopped abruptly. The silence returned, thicker than before. I settled back by the fire, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself I was imagining things. The woods at night always played tricks on you. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the cold and the strange sounds of the night. At some point, I was woken by the crackling of the fire dying down. I sat up, pulling my coat tighter around me, and noticed the fire was nearly out. I grabbed some wood and fed the flames, the light flickering against the dark trees. Then I heard it again, the thumping footsteps, slower this time, coming from the far edge of the clearing. I shone my flashlight in that direction, heart pounding, but still saw nothing. The sound stopped once more. I stayed awake for hours, the fire keeping me company. The cold seeped in, but I refused to go back inside the tent. Something was out there, something watching. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was exhausted and trembling. The footsteps had stopped. The woods were silent again, but the feeling lingered, like I had just barely escaped something. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I broke down the tent. I kept my eyes on the dark forest, but saw no movement. The frozen lake looked peaceful in the pale morning light, but I didn't trust it. The hike back felt endless. Every snap of a branch or crunch of snow underfoot made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced something was following me, but there was nothing there. When I finally reached my truck, relief flooded through me. I locked the doors and started the engine, feeling the warmth from inside the cab spread through my body. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the forest fading behind me. I never told anyone about that night. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I know what I heard, and I know what I felt. The woods aren't always peaceful, not even on Christmas. It was Christmas Eve, and I was alone in the house. The snow had been falling steadily since early morning, thick and heavy, covering everything in a cold white blanket. The kind of snow that muffles sound and makes the world feel far away. I didn't mind being alone for the holiday this year. Most people I knew had plans to be with family, and I had no family close by anymore. Just me, the house, and the storm outside. The house I lived in was old, built decades ago, long before most of the modern homes in the neighborhood. It had creaky floors, thin walls, and windows that didn't seal tightly. I had wrapped some old, faded Christmas lights around the front porch railing, but they flickered weakly in the wind. The cold seeped in through the cracks, and I could see my breath inside the house. I kept a fire burning in the small stone fireplace in the living room, but it barely warmed the whole place. The wooden mantel above was decorated with pine branches and a few ornaments I had bought at a thrift store weeks ago. The faded red and gold colors of the decorations gave a faint, almost sad feeling to the room. I had spent most of the day preparing a simple Christmas dinner. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, some canned green beans heated in a pan. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me busy and to make the day feel special. The small kitchen smelled warm and comforting from the herbs I had used, and the oven's heat pushed some warmth into the cold house. After dinner, I sat down in my old armchair by the fire with a cup of hot tea. The tea had gone cold quickly because the fire wasn't strong enough to keep the room warm. Outside, the wind howled, pushing snow against the windows in thick gusts. The street was empty. No cars, no people, just the sound of the storm. I wasn't scared of storms. I had lived in this house for years, and winter storms were normal. But that night felt different. There was a quiet heaviness in the air, something I couldn't explain. I kept hearing small noises, creaks from the house settling, branches scraping against the windows, the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. It was odd because I didn't expect anyone to be outside in this weather. No one passed by this late, especially with the roads barely visible under the snow. I thought about locking the doors again, even though I had already done it twice. The locks were old and rusty but had held up so far. I got up slowly and went to check the front door. The wind pushed against it like it was trying to force it open. I pressed my shoulder against the cold wood and felt the door shudder slightly. Outside, the porch light flickered and went out, leaving the entrance in near darkness. I fumbled for my phone on the small table by the door to use its flashlight. The screen lit up my hand, showing the frost on the window next to the door. I peered outside. The snow was falling harder now, and the street was a white blur. But at the edge of the porch light's reach, something moved. A shadow, quick and low, darting behind a tree. My heart jumped. I told myself it was probably just a stray animal, maybe a rabbit or a raccoon, but the sound of footsteps in the snow didn't match the small, quick paws of an animal. It was heavier, like someone walking slowly but carefully. I locked the door again, then double-checked the back door and windows. All secure. The windows had their curtains drawn, but I left the living room window slightly cracked open to let some air in. I moved back to my chair by the fire, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept hearing that crunching sound in the snow outside, steady but slow, coming closer and then fading away. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the old radio, hoping for some Christmas music to fill the silence. The static buzzed before a soft, scratchy version of Silent Night played, low and distant. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the music, on the comfort of the fire, but I kept hearing the steps. The wind brought more than snow. It brought something else, a sense of being watched. The power flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the orange glow of the dying fire. I reached for a flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark like a knife, showing familiar corners and furniture covered in shadows. Outside the window near the kitchen, I saw it again, the shadow. This time it was clearer. A figure, low and moving slowly behind the trees at the edge of my yard. I could see the outline of a person, hunched and cautious. Whoever it was, they were trying to avoid being seen. My mind raced. Who could be out there? Why? The storm made the roads dangerous. No one should be wandering alone. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police. No signal. The storm had cut off cell towers or lines. I cursed quietly, the cold creeping into my bones. I thought about the neighbors, but their houses were at least a few hundred yards away, and none had lights on. I decided I couldn't just sit and wait. I got up, put on my boots and coat, grabbed a flashlight and a heavy kitchen knife from the drawer. I moved slowly toward the back door, careful not to make noise. I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The snow was thick, and the wind cut sharply at my face. The figure was gone. I stepped outside onto the porch. The cold hit me like a wall. The crunch of snow under my boots was loud. I scanned the yard, shining the flashlight toward the woods behind the house. Nothing but white and black trees. Then I heard it again. A soft, steady crunch from the side yard. I turned quickly and pointed the flashlight in that direction. There, between two pine trees, a shadow moved. This time it was a man, wearing a thick coat and a hood pulled low over his face. He was watching the house. Not running, not hiding, just standing. My heart hammered. I called out to him, but my voice was weak against the wind. He didn't move or respond. I raised the knife but didn't move forward. He turned and walked slowly toward the edge of the woods, disappearing into the trees. I locked the door and went back inside, breathing hard. I knew I had to call someone, but there was no signal. The power was out. I felt trapped. The storm wasn't letting up, and whoever that was outside could come back. I sat back by the fire, now only a small pile of glowing embers. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stared at the window. The snow continued to fall silently, covering any trace of the footsteps outside. Hours passed. The storm finally started to calm. The wind dropped, and the snow slowed to a light drizzle. I felt my eyelids grow heavy, but I stayed awake, listening. Around dawn, I heard a new sound: sirens. Far away but getting closer. The neighbors must have called after seeing the lights outside. Relief flooded me. The police arrived just as the first sun rays broke through the clouds. They found tracks in the snow, footprints circling the house, stopping and starting, like the person was watching, waiting. But no one was caught. The police said it was probably a homeless man or someone lost in the storm. They assured me it wasn't likely to come back. That Christmas morning, the sun shone bright, the snow glistening like crystals. I felt safe again, but the fear from the night lingered. I locked all the doors twice, checked every window, and made sure my phone was charged. I realized that sometimes the real terror isn't ghosts or monsters, but the simple fact of being vulnerable, alone, and watched in the dark.